So today we are very pleased to welcome Marco Baroni, who is acting as a consultant of the IEA today, but who spent a lot of time at the IEA, and I will let him introduce himself. So he is very knowledgeable on both energy statistics and energy modeling, especially in the power sector. So we will spend the 2 hours together looking at a presentation that you received and also at an exercise, which is a simplified model of a power building, a power simplified power model. So we will we'll spend this time together and also with some questions. But just to remind you about the global agenda, so we are in the 3rd session of our course. We will have 4 more sessions this week to continue on modeling. Housekeeping rules. So you know that you are getting used to go to menti.com for live poll questions. If you have any question, please raise your hand. You can ask your questions using the Q&A box, or you can also raise your hand and we can give you the floor. And for any additional question, please reach out per email. So before I give the floor to Marco, maybe some first polling question, and then we will ask you to go to the usual website www.menti.com, and I will give you the code in a second. Okay, can you see the Menti one? Sorry, Marco, maybe you want to introduce yourself while participants are joining the Menti.
Well, good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. As Arnaud very kindly said, my name is Marco Baroni. I have been working at the IEA for quite many years, about 15 years of my working experience. I also worked for Dutch electricity and gas utility, and now a consultant. And among these, my consultant activities, I'm also consulting for the IEA, and I am also teaching a course in university in Sciences Po in France. So here we are. I will be delighted to go through the power presentation together. I haven't seen the start of the Menti questions. I don't know if everyone is being able to access, or maybe I'm not just seeing the results. No. Oh yeah, I'm seeing them now. So it will be a pleasure to go through this presentation together. Please do not hesitate to ask questions. I will stop once a while, but please do stop me anytime, because I really like the interaction during the presentation. So any questions you might have, it will be a pleasure to answer throughout the whole presentation. If anything is not clear, but also if you have additional questions that I didn't touch upon. Arnaud, for respect to you.
Yeah, so we are having a first answer. So just to give you again the question, we were asking you to rank different sectors according to their energy, to their electricity demand for Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. So the 5 proposals are residential, industry, services, transport, and agriculture. As we saw during the first modeling sessions, these are the energy subsectors we disaggregate to look at the different energy model items. So I see that the answers push residential and industry as the first sector for electricity demand, and that's indeed the case in Sub-Saharan Africa. So you are very, very right. Maybe we can let a bit more time for more answers, but I can already say that yeah, in industry and residential are the top 2, maybe not in the order that they appear as it. So maybe giving you the numbers. Actually, it's industry which is number one, but very, very closely followed by residential. No, sorry, excuse me. I'm confusing. It's residential, which is number one, and followed by industry. So you are indeed very right. They are both around 75 to 80 terawatt hour. Then come services, which is half the value at 40 terawatt hour. And then very small share of the electricity demand come from the agriculture and then the transport subsectors. So yeah, we are very close to the right answer, and indeed it's residential sector who is the first. So moving to another question, if you still use the Menti website, we'd like to ask you if do you think we can expect the electrification of final uses in the future to decrease, to remain about the same, or to increase? This might seem obvious, but then in the course with Marco, we'll see maybe how to estimate such evolution and how to build hypotheses, assumptions to assess a bit more by how much such an increase would happen. Okay, Marco, I'll let you comment more and then shift to the course as you want.
Well, indeed, the answer is quite clearly 100% correct. There is always, and you have seen it in previous courses, the point of the difference between the electricity use in final sectors and the energy, the demand for energy services in final sectors, and the difference being the efficiency of the equipments that are going to be used. Of course, there is a balance to be taken into account between these two. There is little doubt that the demand for energy services will increase. How much the electrification of the final uses will increase depends also on the level of efficiency of the different equipment in the different sectors. Indeed, I think that the answer is clearly 100% sure, correct. So I think we can move on. I don't know if that is okay, because the presentation is a bit longer, as you have seen. I think that you all have received it. It's a bit long. We will a little bit go fast throughout some of the slides because we give for granted that some of the aspects are much more well known, while others might deserve spending a little bit more time. But as I mentioned before, if I go too fast, if we go too fast on certain topics, please do not hesitate to stop and ask even about slides where we go a little quick. I will take the screen. I don't know if that is okay for all of you, and I will ask for confirmation if you are seeing the screen.
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, perfect. So the first quite obvious question is why are we looking at the power sector? Well, the first answer, again obvious, is, well, we're looking at the overall of the energy system, and the power sector is a big part of it. But it's also, of course, because the power sector has such an important role in the overall equation of the energy sector. Now, if we look at my apologies. Okay, at the world level, well, we see, and you have seen already, how electricity accounts for about 20% of final energy, with different shares depending on the different countries or regions. With a very significant amount in industry and residential, in services, in agriculture, and very little in transport, as we know, a sector being dominated by oil products. In terms of CO2 emissions, there is, well, the power sector in terms of direct emissions emits about 40% of the emissions globally. Of course, to take into account, it depends how you count them, because you might look in the industry sector, in the residential sector, at indirect emissions. So the emissions related to the electricity demand in those sectors, and then reallocate these emissions to those sectors. And of course, in terms of energies, well, it accounts for a very important share of all the different energies. Again, not much for oil. What is the situation for Africa? Well, the situation for Africa is extremely similar. Little differences in share terms, but the big difference is that among the final sectors, it accounts for a much smaller share, as you can see, of the residential sector, as the residential sector uses still a lot of traditional biomass or biomass used in traditional ways in the residential sector. Of course, here we have the differences between the world, Africa, and Ethiopia in particular, Ethiopia being one of the very low emitting sectors in terms of power sector in the world, thanks to its big hydro potential. And in fact, if we look at today and the possible prospects for the future, we will come back on that, of course. But if we look at Ethiopia, we know how today the largest part of generation is comes from hydro resources, and this is expected to continue to be in the future, although with gaining shares from other renewable sources, in particular solar photovoltaics and wind, but also other renewables. With, of course, depending on what type of scenario we look at, we have different type of futures. But if we can summarize, well, more or less, in the stated policies, so the policies that are considered today and the expected evolution to 2040, we have more or less a quadrupling of electricity generation between today and 2040. And as you can see, with the vast majority of the increase coming from hydro, from PV, wind, and other renewables. Again, very similar situation in the Africa case that was developed in the World Energy Outlook in 2019, where the electricity generation would even double in 2040 with respect to the stated policies, almost double to about 150 terawatt hour in 2040, again with the lion's share taken by hydro and solar PV. We will come back on these two, but of course these two sources are the largest contributors, as you know perfectly. Now we will directly go to the core of the presentation. Core of the presentation, which is looking at the basics of the power system, touching about some of the economics, and finally looking at the integration of variable renewables. So effectively, what we will look at in the beginning will be a world without solar, PV, and wind, not because they're not important, all the contrary, they're very important, but because they bring new aspects to the power system and to the way the power system needs to be modeled. So we thought that first it's better to see how you normally would model the power system, and then see what are the changes introduced by these sources that are often referred to as variable renewables. Some people call them intermittent. It doesn't really matter how you call them, but effectively they produce together with when the resource is available. So they introduce an additional change in the way we need to model them. So without further ado, we start with the basic principles. Now, basic principles, again, I would go a bit fast if you don't mind, because you know all of these perfectly. I will stop once a while to see if there is any questions, and I will ask Arnaud if you don't mind checking the Q&A and the discussions in case I lose something. Going back to the general principles, obvious points. Well, first, in this presentation, we will look mostly at on-grid, the type of modeling that you do for the on-grid part, leaving the off-grid part aside for a different presentation, but also because the logics are significantly different. Now, of course, if we look at the on-grid one, there are three main parts where you produce your electricity, where you consume your electricity, and how you connect the two, so through transmission and distribution grids. Of course, this is for on-grid. As mentioned, there is all the off-grid and in between the mini-grid systems. And depending on how much you want to go into detail of your modeling, what you can do in more sophisticated models is look at the development of the two parts, or actually the three, including also mini-grid, and how off-grid solutions can turn into mini grids locally, and then the more the overall grid expands, they get interconnected with the main grid. We have mentioned the difference between useful energy, or the demand for energy services, the final consumption of energy, so in this case, of course, electricity, and we can see at the global level, but this is true more or less everywhere, how that 20%, about 1/5, which is sort of a magic number that everybody quotes when talking about these issues, at the global level, share of electricity in total final consumption is in reality a higher share when you look at it from useful energy point of view, and how the building and industry side, building being, of course, residential and services. So the buildings and the industry sectors are the two largest consumers. So as the first Menti question was asking, that is not, of course, the situation only in Africa, but also everywhere else in the world. And as we mentioned, we expect the share of electricity in final energy demand to grow. When we're saying we expect this is a result of a scenario. Of course, different scenarios bring different results, but this is a trend that we can see in a number of scenarios, if not in all scenarios. What changes is the rate of growth and the rate of growth of the different countries. You can see how the rate of growth of China between 2000 and 2020 has been growing in a spectacular way due to the big growth of China in terms of energy consumer. Of course, the trend continuing forward will change or can change significantly depending on the policy adopted, and in particular the role of energy efficiency, as we mentioned. Now, The future is increasingly electric. Yes, of course. We've seen this we've said this, and we've seen it in a number of cases. Now, in 2020, what happened, and I will re-show it, is of course a contraction of electricity demand due to the COVID emergency. With some countries that recovered more quickly, as you can see, China already in 2020 sees a little increase, not as strong as before, but still a little increase, while many other countries saw an overall decrease due to further lockdowns throughout the year. When we look forward, though, and as the COVID emergency resolves, we expect this situation to be resolved and electricity demand to keep increasing. Where is the demand, most of the demand going to come from? Well, the answer is always the same, and it's mainly from developing countries. So if we look at the increase, you can see how strong is the increase in India that you will see in a second, switching with the EU, but also a very strong increase in Africa that you have seen in the graph, with respect to with a very strong increase with respect to the demand in 2019. Now, how do we meet this this growth of demand? Well, we need to supply electricity, and today modeling is all about the demand and supply balance. And if we look at the past, most of this was covered by an increase in fossil fuels, mainly in coal and gas, with coal taking the lion's share, in particular in developing countries, with some decrease in more advanced economies, and with wind and solar PV making inroads, but still at a much lower level than coal. Because of the strong decrease of costs of PV, what we expect in the what can be expected in the stated policy scenario is already a very strong growth of solar PV. Is cheaper, is the cheapest source in many countries, and a decrease of coal as the growth in some developing countries doesn't outweigh the decrease in advanced economies anymore. So overall, with a little bit of a decrease of coal and a strong increase of PV and wind, if we look at more sustainable scenarios, like the sustainable development scenario done by the in the World Energy Outlook, well, we see how coal decreases significantly. So the move away from coal is really significant, almost 8,000 terawatt hour. A very strong growth of low carbon sources, wind and other, but mainly the big growth of solar PV for the reasons that we mentioned. So how do we model all of this? Well, the first thing to take into account and to always remember is electricity has one peculiarity, which is it cannot be stored in huge quantities. Again, some of the things that I'm going to say are true in general and are sometimes slightly less true in countries that have the luck, like Ethiopia, to have more hydro resources. Why? Because hydro has two big important aspects. First, it allows for storing of electricity, and this is the point of this slide. And the second is it can be produced in large quantities. So going to the storing point, the electricity has one peculiarity with respect to the other sources. and it's the fact that you cannot store big quantities like of energy like you can do with oil or gas or coal, and therefore at the same time. This is true in across seasons, is true across months, weeks, days. So always decreasing intervals. Of course, the shorter this goes, the more there are solutions to storing to be able to store electricity. We will use the World Energy Outlook model schematic, as you have seen already, to describe a number of the elements of power modeling. Always keeping in mind, though, that this refers to the World Energy Model, so the model used for the World Energy Outlook. But this is also true for a lot of different models that can be available across in the world and across sectors. A little summary that you have seen already this schematic a number of times, but it's the World Energy Model is a demand-driven model that starts from the demand for energy services, estimates the demand for the final energy demand, looks at the transformation sector to arrive to primary energy demand, and this is then put in balance with the supply sector of fossil fuels and biomass. What is the equilibrium between the two is fossil fuel prices. Now, this part here that I'm circling, so all that is called the demand part till total primary energy demand is one model. It's all integrated in one model in the IEA, and therefore the power generation sector that we're going to discuss now is in equilibrium with the demand coming from the final uses, again, like in this case, through through electricity prices. Now, electricity prices can be passed back to energy consumers in different ways. Of course, there are different mechanisms, but in the end, somebody has to pay. How that how these are paid for depends on the country, but of course this type of feedback is always necessary. I will stop 1 second to see if there is any questions still now, because I am afraid of overwhelming a little bit, because I'm going a little bit with a number of points. But given that I don't see any questions, I will continue. I apologize. I will insist a number of times saying that if you want to ask any questions, I am and we will be very happy to discuss all of these points. So, as I mentioned, the demand feeds into the power generation sector that feeds back the prices. This is what we just discussed. Now, another way of looking at this is the demand from, it's simply another visual representation, the demand from the final sectors. We always have to be a little bit careful when we're modeling. Demand and generation are not exactly the same thing. There are few elements in between. So you have demand of the final sectors, you have electricity demand, but then you have to take into account the losses on the grids, the own use of the power plants, whatever power trade you have, if there is any in the country, and that gives the total generation in the country. That generation, total generation in the country required, so the total load is to to be met through different type of plants, generally electricity or CHP. CHP being the ones that produce both electricity and heat. And out of this, you can have electricity prices or costs, as we mentioned. It depends really on the way that the market or the system works in each different country, and these, depending on the model considered, do or do not feed back to the final sectors. I would always advise to have some sort of feedback so that this can be taken into account. Now, if we move to the second part, we will now look at the submodules and the capacity addition mechanism, which is one of the main elements. Now, when we're talking, there is one thing that to always keep in mind and to remember. When we're talking about the power sector, we're talking about a lot of subsectors. And when I'm talking about a lot of different subsectors, is because each subsector is developed. Okay, let me stop 1 second. Every model, as you have seen in all the previous presentations, is done to answer a question. There is no model that can fit all questions and that can answer all questions. You develop models to be able to answer certain questions. And of course, you have to make simplifications in mathematical terms of all the different aspects of reality. How do you do that? Well, by identifying the main drivers in the different sectors. So when we're talking about the power sector, we need to identify what are the main drivers of each of the sub-sectors that we want to analyze more in detail. Now, of course, here we have listed a number of different sub-modules that can have very different drivers, and that, of course, will be important or not important for each country, depending on what is important for that country. For example, the nuclear sub-module is really unimportant for countries that are not developing nuclear plants, or the renewable module that here is marked as one sub-module, in reality takes into account a lot of different renewable sources. And of course, it's the big starting point is, well, do you have that availability or not? So what is the potential of deploying renewable sources in the country that you're considering, in this case, in your country? But also the access, the electricity access submodule depends on the rate of electrification and the way that the access to population is going to develop. What are the different policies tackling this issue? Are you in need or not for freshwater resources? So do you need or not desalination plants, and so on and so on and so forth. So all these different submodules are developed with different drivers in different ways, but in the end they all concur to the same point, to the same part, which is all aggregated in the same pool, in the same overall of what is the capacity available in your country. Then how do you run it, and therefore what are your results? Well, the obvious two results are the capacity and the generation, so how much you produce from the plants that you have installed. And of course, what are the fuel inputs requirements? What are the emissions following the fuel inputs? What are the prices? What are the investments needed to install these capacities? Very important point to remember. Now, if we go to the generalities of the power sector, we could go through this schematic and stop on this for 20 minutes by itself, but I will not. You have seen this in the general presentation. We have seen this together in the general presentation, and I will just recall two main aspects. You have a number of assumptions, the white elements, a number of calculations, the green ones, and a number of results, the blue ones. But mainly, you have in almost all power models, you have two elements that are the most important ones. One is the way you add the plants. So how your capacity in your country is today and is going to evolve in the future. And the other one is how are you going to use that capacity? So which plants are going to produce how much in which periods in what type of form. So we will now look at the additions of new plants and later at the second point. I will stop again. Sorry, I try to slow down once a while, see if there are questions, and then proceed. I don't see questions, so
no question
I will...
yet, Marco. To all participants, feel free to write your questions in the Q&A box.
There is one question. I think I saw.
I saw a hand raised, but then unraised. So maybe it was out of mistake.
Please raise it again if you wanted to ask the question, because it would be a pleasure to answer. Or it might be that it was just by accident, which
maybe
actually happens. It happens to me quite often. So, okay, I will continue, but really don't hesitate to re-raise it if you have any questions. So I was saying the two main points, the additions and the dispatching. So if we look at the first point, the addition of new plants, well, again, we need to do a little step back and always remember what is the characteristic, one of the many characteristics of power, and it's the fluctuated demand throughout the year. This is just a fictitious adapted demand from one country, which, as you can see, out of the 8,760 hours in a year, has demand highest in winter and lowest in summer. What does this mean if we look at this graph? Is that it's a country where it's sufficiently cold in winter to require more electricity and not so hot in summer to require air conditioning. The typical consumption of electricity of the different countries, if you first look at it from the first hour of the year to the last hour of the year, is that countries that require a lot of air conditioning, you will see quite a high demand in this area. So this one will be higher up here, and the demand in summer would be lower. Now, this is the demand throughout the year, but if we zoom in across 1 month, we can see, in this case, is the month of January, how the demand often changes throughout the week. So if where the working week is 5 days and and the 2 days of the weekend, you can easily see the higher demand, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the 2 of the weekend, and that is repeated over time. But also the difference between the demand during the day and the demand at night. So if we zoom in on a day, we can definitely see the difference between the demand during the day and in the evening, often when people get back home, and instead at night, 3, 4 in the night, where this is the lowest level in most countries. Now, how do you, we go back to the one point that we said earlier on, is how do we simplify all of this? I am a power generation modeler as a background. I've been working a lot of years on this. And in the ideal world, you would like to do a very detailed modeling of everything. The reality is that you need to simplify. You need to simplify for a number of reasons. Well, I've been working also in the statistic division. So at the beginning of my career in the IEA, and I am very well aware of the importance of data and of the availability of data and of the availability of good quality data. Now, this is the basic of everything. I will never say it enough how the importance, I will never stress enough the importance of having good quality data to start with, because without that, any modeling exercise, I wouldn't say that it's useless, but it's much less useful to be able to provide you hints on future trends if the starting data are not good. So we need to have good data. We need to make simplifications to be able to treat all of this. How do we generally simplify this? Well, we can have models with 8,760 hours, but that will require a lot of good data to start with, but also computers that allow for a lot of calculations. So very powerful tools and very powerful computers. Otherwise, the normal thing that is done is simplifying this curve. How do we simplify it? We go back to the curve that we just saw. Well, we simplify it. The normal thing that is done in the power sector is going from the hourly curve to the load duration curve, which is simply done by reordering the 8,760 hours in the year. In this case, we will simplify as the smallest amount of the smallest granularity being 1 hour. We order them from the highest point, which in this case, I have a doubt it would be this one or that one. I would say this one here in December, to the lowest one, which most likely is one of these, difficult to say, let's say this one. We order them, and we can order them from the highest to the lowest. In this case, it's expressed in percentage, and the percentage simply refers to the average of demand of throughout the year. Why the average is because it's much easier than in modeling terms to use the percentage one. Once you have created the load duration curve, well, you can simplify it. You can simplify it in blocks, or sometimes called time slices. Well, the first one is to say, okay, I'll simplify it in two time slices. One is the peaking plants, and one is all the rest. Of course, the biggest the difference between the real curve and the simplified curve is the more there will be an error introduced in your calculations. So you can add segments to try to get that error smaller, and to refine your calculations. This can continue for how many segments you want, reducing more and more these errors. Of course, the more you add the segments, the more you will have you will add complexity to your calculations, the more you will be representing more closely the reality of your calculations. If we stop to the most usual one, so the dividing in 3 segments, well, then it's the usual terminology, the usual things that we that a lot of people talk about when talking in the power sector, and it's peak plants mid-load plants and base load plants. So if we go to that idea, we will look how these, how the logic of these three type of plants changes throughout time. So one an additional thing to take into account is okay, but how much capacity do I need in my system? Well, sorry, I should have stayed here. How much capacity do I need in my system? If I want to meet all the demand in all the moments of the year, what I need to have is enough capacity to cover the highest point of my demand, plus generally some more capacity called capacity margin or has different definitions depending on the country, but let's call it capacity margin. So some more capacity to allow for the capacity that is not available, for the capacity that is on maintenance, for the capacity that has forced outages, simply breaks. There are some plants that inevitably will have problems. And if that happens exactly where when the highest demand is, well, you need to have a security margin on top of it. So one basic way to estimate how much capacity I will need to in my country when going forward is to project my electricity demand. That one comes, as we've seen, from the final sectors, from the demand of the final sectors that we are modeling in the other parts, and hence the importance of having an overall model that looks at the. Sorry, I saw a question. We'll come back to you. I will just finish the sentence. So the overall model that will provide us with this demand. From this one, we estimate what through the historical evolution, what is the difference between the peak demand and the average demand, because of course the one that comes from the final sectors is generally the average one, is the annual one. And then from that one, through the capacity margin, then we estimate how much total capacity we need throughout the year. I will stop 1 second, go back to the question. There is a question saying, how do you derive the demand to hourly resolution? So this one is generally based on historical observation. So all the electricity companies that or the dispatching centers. So there is a body in each country that is generally responsible and sees this electricity demand throughout the whole country. It depends, of course, how the market is organized. If it's a monopoly, but most often is the transmission operator that would have it, or other bodies, depending. So we start from the observation of the historical data. Hence, we go back to the importance of having the good data for the past, and then we continue with all this reasoning that I just mentioned. I will just make a little digression here. This is historical. A very important way to be able to estimate the evolution of the peak demand going forward in time would be to decompose this demand into the different uses. Because, for example, and this is really the case for African countries, where the demand for air conditioning is expected to increase very significantly over time. Of course, that user that will have the majority of its usage in the hottest months of the year, well, that one will change this profile, and therefore will change this relationship of average demand versus peak demand. I'm Italian. This exactly happened in Italy during the 90s, where we passed from a situation similar to this one, being a peak this is so-called the winter peaking country, to becoming a summer peaking country, where the highest level of demand in Italy now is in July. So this part here did shoot up here. So it's now the highest levels of demand are seen in Italy in July. This is a situation that can be expected very easily in a number of countries, in particular in developing countries, in Africa for sure, but also in India, for example. And that would change, of course, this relationship of peak to average point. So when I'm saying that this is a simplified way of modeling, it is true, and it can be as simple as just a rate, but also have all a significant analysis behind to be able to estimate the evolution of that peak to average and of the capacity margin going forward. Now we talked about, I will stop 1 second to see if there is any other question. And please don't hesitate to ask further question if my answer was not explaining enough was not, if you would like to ask more further on your question. Okay, I will continue, but again, please do ask. So we mentioned base, mid, and peak. Now, if we look at historical and going forward, and we have divided our low duration curve into 3 blocks, into base, into mid, and peak, we always have to remember that whatever the capacity of base, mid, and peak we have in the base year, well, we will have some net additions, so some capacity that will be needed going forward to cover the increase of demand, but also some capacity that will be needed to compensate for the retirement of the existing capacity. There will be a part of capacity that will remain over time. Now, in this case, it's linear simply because for simplicity reasons, but in reality, it will depend on how old your park is. In the case, if we want to go to simplifications of advanced economies, the capacity nowadays in a number of plants is pretty old, in particular for what refers to coal plants, to nuclear plants, less to gas plants, and surely wind and solar are much younger. Hydro plants, it really depends when the potential of hydro capacity has been exploited, but also hydro plants are often refurbished and therefore have a quite overall long lifetime. So the remaining capacity will be needs to be of course estimated through the retirements, and what will be needed annually is the sum of net additions for new capacity and to compensate for the retirement of existing capacity, the sum of these two often being called the gross additions. This is very similar to what you have seen in a number of other sectors. In supply is to cover up for the natural decline of oil generation. For example, if we're talking about oil, or in the case of the building sector, for the replacement of air conditioning systems or refrigerators or any other equipment. The logic is always the same. How much do you need for the additional demand and how much to replace the existing stock? The two big peculiarities of the power sector are the long lead times. So power plants have a quite long lifetime. We are talking between, let's say, 25 years for solar PV systems, up to 80 years or 100 years for hydro plants, depending on how you change certain components over time. with the coal plants often having 50, 60 years lifetime. So very long lifetime, but also very long time in a number of cases needed to build the plants. So quite a need to have a good estimate of on how the demand will evolve to be able to anticipate and start building the power plants before. What is the result of all of this? Well, is simplified in a number of graphs that I will go a little bit quickly through, but quite interesting in terms of visual. You have the existing capacity, the retiring one, what you add throughout time to arrive to your total installed capacity. And this shows you how the mix can change over time. Now, of course, this figure is, which is a global figure, will change over time depending on the scenario, on the policies in place. The more, for example, coal plants are prevented from being added, the more this amount will be smaller, the more the policies in support and the economics play in favor of solar PV. You remember the new king that we talked about earlier, the more we will have higher capacity of solar PV. So this mix, of course, is set to change over time, depending on the scenario, depending on the policies in place. With this, we arrive to our third part. Again, I will stop 1 second to see if there is any questions. I don't see any. I am a little bit afraid because questions also allow you to, for some of these ideas to settle down. I'm afraid of overwhelming a little bit, but and that's why I'm slowing down a little bit once in a while. Arnaud, one question that I would have for you is, are we planning to have a 3 minutes break or shall I continue?
No, you can continue, and we'll need to close in an hour.
Okay.
So we have
perfect.
60 minutes remaining.
Perfect. We will. So if we go to the third part is we go back to the 2 central points, the additions and the dispatching mechanism. We've seen the additions of new plants. Of course, now we will look at the dispatching mechanism. Why is this so important? Well, for a number, sorry, I will just put them all up, for a number of reasons. It's because it tells you how the plants are operated. So it gives you all the generation for each type of technology and energy source. Through its efficiency, of course, it tells you how much fuel use you will have for the different energy sources, and therefore, for example, have significant implications on what type of impact does it have on energy security, depending on the country, if you are using a lot of gas plants and you're importing your gas. Of course, it has the implications on CO2 emissions. We said it at the very beginning, depending on how much fossil fuels you're using, and the result on the electricity prices or costs, depending on your system. These results depend on a number of factors and on how the mechanism is done itself. Now, we will look in the next slides quickly at how the merit order works, which is a very commonly used system for dispatching, for determining the dispatching priority. It's not the only one. It's the one that is more economically efficient. So if we start from a situation where we have this graph, of course, needs to be done for every hour if we're looking at an hourly granularity. For every hour of the year, we look at how much is the potential generation for all the plants that we have in our country, ordered by its variable cost or marginal cost, so not taking into account the investment and the fixed costs, for all our different capacity that we have in place in our system. In this case, we included almost all sources, so renewables, biomass, nuclear, lignite, steam coal, gas, and oil, depending also, of course, on which type of technology. These little steps that you see is different efficiencies. Of course, from the lowest to the highest, it means that it's from highest to lowest efficiency. So the highest, the efficiency of the same of a coal plant using the same price of coal, the lowest will be the generation price. The lowest the efficiency, the highest the generation cost. The same applies for gas CCGT, for gas GT, for oil. So depending on where our demand is, let's say our baseload demand, or sometimes called the lowest level of demand, sometimes called also off peak. You will have these plants that will run till this point. These ones will not run, and excuse me, and this will be the resulting price that all of these plants will receive. If in another hour you will have another level of demand, well, then all these plants will run till here, and these ones will not. This will be the price that is set in that hour. At the highest level of demand, peak hour, this is the plant that will these are the plants that will run, these will not, and this will be the resulting price. This, of course, means that the average of all these prices throughout the 8,760 hours of the year will amount to the total electricity price. Sorry, I see a question, and I will stop 1 second. Does house heating is the major factor in the country's electricity demand? Is there any other example that shows us the electricity demand factors by like cooking practice or other factors? Now, electricity demand, of course, will play a very important role, and the house heating, for example, or any competition of electricity in the final sectors will change this level of demand. So this level of demand, and there we go back to the importance of having an overall model, will affect how the electricity demand evolves, both in terms of level, so competition with the other sources, and in terms of this factor that we were saying, for example, for air conditioning. I use that example because in my mind it's very easy to think it's more needed in the warmest during the warmest hours of the year, so days and weeks and months of the year, not hours, excuse me. Well, both are true. So that will change also the relationship between the evolution of the curve throughout the year. Now, this is true for the demand, as the question is very correctly asking. But of course, there are other factors that can influence this curve, which, are the prices of coal and gas that can higher or lower these points, or the existence or not of a CO2 price that will increase or decrease these elements. In the end, you end up with how much will your capacity work throughout the year, and you will be able to see how much of the total installed capacity, the base load, mid load, and peak load that we were talking about, how much is running? Typically, the base load capacity runs a lot of hours. The mid load capacity halfway, and the peak load doesn't run much. Typical values can be in the order of 80%, 50%, 7%. Why are we talking about capacity factor? Because sometimes is more simply making a merit order is a more complex thing from a computational point of view, and therefore capacity factors can be an easier way to go from capacity to generation. We'll go back to that in the Excel example. The results, of course, are seen for electricity demand and for generation. For example, in this graph, which shows the results for sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, in terms of electricity demand and electricity generation. The balance that we've seen can be seen as we've seen it in terms of capacity, can be seen also in terms of generation, from the generation less the retirements plus the additions, the total gross generation that is used in industry, in all the final sectors, in transmission and distribution losses, and in non-use. I will stop 1 second. There is a question. The energy requirement for a household purpose is very much less as compared to industrial requirement. So is that necessary to design model for household? Well, it depends. It depends. I'm sorry that the answer is always it depends, but it's true. It depends on the purpose of your model. If you expect the household demand to increase significantly over time, then the answer is yes. If that is important for the policies of your country, then the answer is yes. If you expect that demand to remain fairly low with respect to the rest, you might want to instead devote more energy, at least in the beginning, to the development of the industrial sector model. But all of them, in my view, are needed for the overall model. Second question, are we assuming perfect competition and perfect information in the electricity market? Well, again, it depends, excuse me if I always say it depends, first on what electricity market is in place in your country. If there is perfect competition or not. There are models that take into account, for example, the possible gaming of the dominant actors in the different countries. Of course, if it is a monopolist, or if there are different players competing one with the other. It depends how you want to model it. You can model both perfect competition or a company having market power, for example. You really can do what you think is more suited to your needs. Going back to the presentation, of course, we've looked from capacity to generation, then from generation to fuel use through efficiency. Efficiency that is different in this case for coal-fired plants, depending on how much capacity you're adding. Not very much in the case of OECD countries, midway for China, and a lot for India, but also with the different levels of what the park to start with is. And then, of course, from the fuel use, you can calculate the emissions with all the related implications, for example, on if you want to reduce emissions going forward. Arnaud, we have now many questions before going to the next part. Do you want to run through it?
Yes, sure.
Thanks
So
very
we
much.
invite you to go back to menti.com, and I will refresh and shift to the next question. So here we are asking you, in your opinion, which is the largest electricity producing source in sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, today or in 2019? So we are proposing all the fuels and sources of electricity production. How would you rank them, and which would be the largest electricity producing source according to you? So this is an interesting question because we are asking it to all the countries with which we are working, and countries have very distinct power mix. So in the case of Senegal, for example, today 90% of their electricity is produced from oil, from HFO, but they will progressively shift to gas, and they have also an increasing share of solar PV and wind. But this is maybe some specific case. The case of Ethiopia, of course, is very different, with, as we all know, a very important share of hydroelectricity. So here the question is, at the scope of sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, what do you think is the first one?
Yes, as Francois, excuse me, as Arnaud said, it's quite dependent on what you are used to, what your country is often producing. But in this case, being almost the entire continent, a lot of different factors need to be taken into account.
So maybe to give you the numbers, indeed, still looking at sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, where the weight of coal is huge, but we are not including South Africa. And in that case, hydropower is the first, hydroelectricity is the first source. It generated 125 terawatt hour in 2019, which is more than half of the electricity produced in this region. So you are very right saying that hydroelectricity is number one. Then number two is gas, which you've not voted for, with 1/4 of the electricity generated, almost 25%. And then will come oil with 15%, coal, and last we have the modern renewables, wind, bioenergy, solar PV, and geothermal, which account for a bit less than 5%. So this is the picture in 2019. Now what we'd like to ask you is, next question, according to you, which source has increased the most since 2014 in the same region? So many of you are voting for solar PV. Sorry for the typo. So it's solar PV, and indeed, this is the first source in terms of growth over the period 2014-2019. It has been growing by 30% every year, but of course, you need to keep in mind that it was starting for a very low level, and still today in Africa, the potential for solar PV is huge, is tremendous, and largely under-tapped, because today in Africa, so now looking at the continent entirely, we have approximately 6 gigawatt of installed solar PV capacity, which is almost the same as what you have today in the Netherlands or in the UK. And we all know Africa is way wider and sunnier than the UK, so there is potential for much more development in solar PV. So the prospect for growth of solar PV are also very important. But it's been the electricity source which has most grown over the last 5-6 years. The number 2 is wind power. And actually, if we look at the last decade, so not the last 5-6 years, but the last 10 years, it's wind power who was fastest growing, also because it started from low level. Maybe to comment on hydroelectricity, again, it depends country by country, and we know in Ethiopia there are very important projects of dams, and they might have been in the recent years some new additions of hydropower capacity. And there is a lot of potential in Africa, but hydroelectricity has also been the electricity source, an electricity source very developed for a long time. So it's harder to have such a rate of growth when you are starting from an important level. Marco, I let you comment or add on this.
No, it was perfect. Shall we go back to the? Sorry, I don't have anything
sure.
to
I
add
see there are
because
questions.
You said it. Yeah, I will address the questions.
Okay, yeah, questions are not related to the Mentis. Okay, you can take back the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. So, can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Thank you. So we are before we go back to the fourth part, the question. There is a question asking: should we consider reserve of power stability of power system stability in the model, when particularly when looking at selecting the type of power source? The answer is yes. Considering the reserve is part of that capacity margin that I was talking about, and of course the type of capacity that you choose not only for that capacity margin but for the overall stability of the system is important, and we will get back to that when looking at the last part, so the integration of variable renewables, when effectively you need to have more capacity, because it depends how much you always have to make considerations of what is the amount of capacity available at times of peak demand. So what is how much reliable is that capacity in terms of at the times of peak demand? But there are also other considerations to be taken into account. These, though, at very high level of penetration, like the stability of the system and the rotating power and the inertia of the power system and so on. Inertia of the power system in this case is how much can the system absorb of the fluctuations of demand and with the rotating elements of the rest of the system. Going to the fourth part, I will go a little bit quicker here because I would like to spend a little bit more time on the integration of solar and wind, and also on the exercise. Now, just few elements to mention. You often hear the LCOE, so the levelized cost of electricity, as the main indicator, or one of the main indicators being used to compare different energy sources. Well, this is on one side a very powerful indicator, because it allows you to give you all the costs fixed and variable in one figure, with certain assumptions on the evolution over time of generation in particular. So it's a very simple thing because it returns you one number. On the other side, it needs to be used with a little bit of care, because the meaning of this is very different depending on the type of usage that you can have. In particular, if you're using the plant for base load or for peak load. So for example, you see the difference between, I'll take a very typical base load is nuclear, and a very typical peak load is either gas GT or oil GT. These will always be higher than nuclear. It doesn't mean that these are not profitable and nuclear is profitable. It really depends on the use and what is the price during the hours when they're running. So it's a powerful indicator within its class of usage. It doesn't really allow much for comparison, if not to compare, for example, two base load capacities, two base load technologies. So for example, nuclear and coal, or nuclear and I don't know, gas CCGT, where gas is sufficiently cheap. This is the typical more complex formula, and this is the typical simplified formula. I will not go through them, but if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to come back to us and we will explain more about that. The advantages, I explained them. The limitations of LCOEs, there are several, but effectively the main one, which is the one that I just, well, an implicit one that I just mentioned, is it allows to evaluate the costs of the electricity produced from a certain technology, but not the value of the electricity produced, because the value depends on the hours when you are producing. So this is an indicator to be taken with a little bit of caution. It's still very useful. It's just something to keep in mind. And for example, the IEA has, not only the IEA, several institutions have looked at ways to go beyond the LCOE and proposed additional indicators that take into account these additional elements. The IEA, since few years, is proposing one of these, which I think is a very good way to go beyond. Another element that you might sometimes look at or be compared or exposed to is the screening curve. It's another way of presenting the LCOE, but so the costs fixed and variable, but with the cost changing throughout all the 8,760 hours. And effectively, going from the fixed cost, which is the starting point, plus and adding throughout time the variable cost, you can see how the cheapest sources, depending on how many hours you will be running your plant, can be for peak plants. So for the ones that are not running much, would be a gas GT. For a mid-load plant, in this case, will be a CCGT, a gas CCGT, then a coal plant, and then a nuclear plant for very high utilization factors. So this represents the technologies with the minimum costs throughout the entire year, depending on the amount of hours run. Of course, in one of the main output of models that we mentioned are investments. With all the considerations of investments, there is always one thing to be very careful with the models, among many others, is that anything can happen in energy models. But then you need to see if these results are coherent with what can happen in the country. So an investment in new capacity in a model happens unless you put a constraint. But will that be investment? What will be the conditions for that investment to happen? These are all additional considerations that need to be taken into account in the analysis that you make with the results of your model. So this is true, for example, when we look at the case of Africa, where in the analysis done in 2019, we could see how the investments needed to double in the stated policy scenario, and double again in the Africa case throughout the period. But if we compare this to in a share of GDP, for example, case, well, we can see how this is. We're talking about huge numbers, but still feasible numbers. So again, you need to put these numbers in context and try to see what are the barriers to be overcome for these investments to take place, for these investments to happen. So this is a summary of the principal calculations. Again, very simple, but always to keep in mind, from capacity to electricity generation, capacity factors, from electricity generation to fuel inputs, efficiencies, you would not know how many people do invert these two elements, from fuel inputs to CO2 emissions through emission factors. Capacity, of course, develops due to the development of gross additions, which are the sum of net and replacements. And these, through the unit investment cost, give you your investment costs. Almost all these elements contribute through fuel costs to the creation of that LCOE indicator that we mentioned. I think this can be a very simple, or is a very simple summary, but that can be quite useful for a number of calculations when you want to make them. With this, I would go to the last part, but I will again stop 1 second to see if there is any additional questions. Okay, I will go to that. So why are we talking about PV and wind? Obvious reasons that have been already mentioned a number of times. They're increasing. They have been increasing a lot. They will increase a lot. The costs are very low. So the world is set to see a very big increase of PV and wind capacities and generation. Of course, like all renewables, one of the main elements playing into it is the potential. Potential is setting the maximum level that can be reached, but also the way this will be reached. You have already seen the development of S-curves in the building sector, so I will not go back to this, but of course, remembering that the development of S-curves is not a one determined factor. It can have a number of different shapes. Often the factor, if it is happening earlier or later, and the steepness of the curve in the central point depends a lot on the type of policies put in place. Why are we talking about wind and PV separately? We go back to the point made at the beginning, is because their production is variable with the resource, with the natural resource. So the usual wind depends on when wind is blowing, and solar PV when sun is shining. That is an obvious thing. I will most often talk about solar PV first because of its big potential for growth, in particular in Africa, but everywhere in the world, but also because the production profile is very easy to remember. There is no generation during night, and it's a bell shape throughout the day. Now, what are the characteristics of these three elements? Well, scarcity, abundancy, and variability. Now, scarcity and abundancy can sound as two things conflicting one with each other. Well, they're not, because you can have scarcity during night, so you don't have generation from PV. You can have abundancy in the sense that you can have too much generation during the day, depending, of course, on how much solar PV you have been installing. Another very important element is the variability. So how much is the difference between the highest point during the day throughout the different days of the month, but also of the year. In certain cases, this variability is not so pronounced. In Africa, it's less. For example, in Europe, for example, it's higher, with winter being at a much lower level than in summer. But also another aspect of variability, which has a very important aspect on the flexibility of the system, is the ramping up and down of the production, and therefore the opposite that is needed from the system, how the other sources need to decrease and increase throughout the day. We will come back to this when we will look at the case of California. This is just a description of these three elements that I will leave for later. So what is the impact of PV and wind on the systems? Well, there are several impacts. The first one is the impact on the total installed capacity. As we mentioned, the installed capacity is will change in the system due to the fact that the availability of the capacity at peak times is often only a fraction of the overall installed capacity. Just to say, if there are 10 gigawatts available in the country of solar PV, what is available at peak is reliably available is maybe 2 gigawatts. So there will be 8 on top of the rest. The rest needs of the case without PV, which means that the rest needs to have additional capacity in the system. This capacity, though, that will be in the system will run less over time. So you will have capacity present in the system that will run less during the year. There will be this requirement for the flexibility that we mentioned, and we will touch back again. There will be impacts on the merit order dispatch and therefore on the prices resulting from the merit order itself. A very significant impact can be also on the use of the grids. Of course, here we're talking about high level of deployment. Whenever we're talking about low level of deployments that can be in the order of 5-10% of total generation in the country, generally don't bring very big issues of any of these elements unless they are very concentrated in a very specific area. But in general, there is no such problem. Another very big impact is all the reasoning that we've been doing on, for example, the low duration curve doesn't hold anymore. But there is a solution that we will explore in a second. First, the ramping that we mentioned. I find this this figure very telling, and that's why I use it a lot. It's produced by the Californian TSO, the transmission system operator, and it shows how the demand of the daily demand in 2012, when there was no PV, and with growing amount of generation from PV, reduced the call on all other plants throughout the years. So effectively, going from this level to this level in 2020, actually, this was the expected one. The actual one on a single day was to this level even. So with a big variability. Now, here we are already introducing the idea of net load. We will come back to this. The net load is the difference between the overall demand and the production from solar PV. Whenever I say solar PV, I mean PV and wind. Remember this. And so here you can see very clearly how the decrease, but mainly the increase in these hours of demand, and therefore the call on the other generators will be stronger and stronger, is stronger and stronger throughout the years. And therefore the system needs to be able to be flexible, which means ready to react, to be able to provide this generation in only the space of 3 hours. So in 3 hours, it increases really significantly. This is a very important aspect to take into account. Now we talked about the impact on the load duration curve and the solution. We go through the idea of net load and therefore the residual load demand. So before we had the hourly demand and the load duration curve. This is not really a reasoning that is valid anymore because of the variability of solar PV, because that curve assumes that all the different generations, all the different technologies can generate whenever is needed. The solution is to go through an intermediate step, taking the overall load, subtracting the generation of solar PV in this case, and obtaining this residual load demand. And that point, instead of having the load duration curve that we had before, we create the residual load duration curve, in this case shown for 3 different levels of solar PV deployment. So you can see how the load duration curve is becoming steeper and steeper over time. What is the impact on the time slices? If you express this instead of absolute in percentage, you can see much more this how it becomes steeper. Of course, it changes the requirements on the type of capacities that are needed. These were the 3 needed in our base case that we have looked at the beginning of the morning. This is what will be needed later on. So much more of peak and mid, much less of base load capacity. If we look at it in absolute terms, this is the same graph turned into in absolute. You see how there is more needed for peak load, much more for mid load, and much less for base load. With the 2 elements that are very much important. At peak load, there is not much that is contributing. That depends if it is a summer or a winter peaking country. In a summer peaking country, that difference is bigger. But after a while, that situation is true as well, and much less need for base load capacity. At one point, of course, the more you add, the more this will risk to go negative. Negative means what? That you have too much generation. It means that you need to put in place integration measures to avoid losing your generation, because that would be a waste. So 1 and 2 elements, as we mentioned, being the most important elements. So you want to avoid that curve to go negative. So you want to avoid curtailment. Also because, of course, the price by definition at that point becomes 0, and you want, and that has a very significant impact on the recovery of the investment costs, both for the variable renewables technologies themselves and for the other technologies. And of course, this can be counteracted by a number of integration measures. The 4 main ones are increasing the flexibility of the system that is needed to allow higher shares of PV and wind, but also the introduction of more energy storage that can be hydro storage or batteries, for example, or any other type of storage, but these 2 being the biggest ones. Of demand side management, you move demand from moments when there is no production of PV, for example, to moments when you have it. And of course, increasing the interconnection of the grid to be able to smooth this variability effect. We could go through more these integration measures, but unfortunately, we don't have enough of time. But this is just to remember that different solutions have different value depending on the duration that you want in terms of reaction of your flexibility measure. Now, with this, I would conclude the presentation and go to the Excel exercise during our last 15 minutes. But again, I would stop 1 second to see if there is any additional questions before going to the Excel exercise. I don't see questions. So I would maybe proceed to the Excel exercise. Now you have received the Excel exercise, and I don't know how many of you had the possibility of going through it. Also because I realized that it can be well, for people that are, for those that are very used to the sector, it can be oversimplified. For the persons that are not very used to the sector, it can be quite complicated. As always, we have our specialities and the things that we know better. And for who is for those that are used to the power sector, the building sector modeling will be more difficult, and vice versa. I will maybe just go through a couple of issues. Let me just load the exercise first without the solutions and then with the solutions. I would ask I don't know if are you seeing my Excel?
Yes, the previous view was broader screen.
Can
What
you
you had
see?
just, we can see, but it's a bit thin. Maybe
because I expanded it. Let's try again now.
yeah, this is better.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect. Sorry, depending on the screen where I put it, it changes. Very funny. So this is the file that you received. I will go through before getting to the exercise, just visually and mentally through the file, how it's organized, because it's very much organized exactly in the same way as the presentation is organized. With and I will enlarge now. I will enlarge, go zoom in and zoom out to be for you to be able to see better the elements. But effectively, you have historical years and projected years for different sections. The first section being the electricity demand, going from demand to total gross generation and then peak demand. If you expand all of these elements, you have the demand, which in this case, of course, is set exogenously. So we decide ourselves what would be the growth rate. But in an integrated model, each one of these lines, so this, and this would be linked to the different sectors that we have been modeling, sorry, till 2030, of course. So for example, the building model would return us this line, and this would be simply linked to that module, with certain assumptions about the evolution of grid losses, on use, and imports, which of course can be changed at your will. You have gross generation, total peak demand through a peak to average ratio. So to obtain from the historical also the future electricity capacity installed in a country. We will fill this in a second. So going back to the blocks, sorry. The first block is demand to peak demand, as we saw in the first part of our presentation, with the same graph you will remember that we had with the generation, peak demand, and total installed capacity. Then we see how to meet these capacities. In the beginning, we started with only 3 types of plants: a coal subcritical, a gas GT and oil GT for base, mid, and peak. So a very extremely simple situation with one base, one mid, one peak plant. But then later on, we have the possibility also of adding a coal supercritical, so a more efficient coal plant and a hydro plant to be able to differentiate the additions over time. So once we have our installed capacity by type, we will have the generation through the capacity factors. Again, all of these elements, as soon as we fill in, will go in a good place. From generation to fuel inputs, thanks to efficiencies, through the, emission factors from generation, from fuel use to the CO2 emissions for each one of the coal, gas, and oil plants, and then the calculation of investments, which is the gross capacity additions times the unit investment costs, as we saw in our overall system, in our overall schematic earlier on. So the first exercise, just to go back 1 second, was let's say that we have the growth over time at 5%. That would be this times 1 plus the growth rate over time. Now, to be able to copy it more easily, excuse me, I need to move. That will be without this. So we take this, we apply it. This, of course, being linked to that cell, this one to this growth rate, oops, and this one to that growth rate. So if we put, for example, that the growth rate that we expected the future growth rate to be a little bit higher than the historical one, this could be at 5 instead of 4 for the industry sector, at 7% for the building sector. I would say that the one in transport could be much higher, so let's say 15%, but still, given that the starting year is very low, then it wouldn't reach very high. And again, for the other sectors, let's take one more. Then, of course, this is it. Do you have any questions still here? I will stop 1 second. Sorry, each time it's better to stop just to see if there is any questions. Okay, I don't see any. So now we can see the evolution the same way as we had the graph in the presentation, and how this is evolving for electricity demand, for peak demand, for total installed capacity. Of course, these from demand to peak is based on that peak to average ratio that is here, that can be changed. So for example, if I change this one to be 1.2, you see how the total will go down, but if I change it to 1.6, it will increase much more. Now, why would that change? Well, it could, well, I will keep it at 1.4. It could change in the case, for example, if you are in a situation, for example, let me take a real example of South Africa. South Africa is in a situation where the current peak to average ratio is very low. So there is not really enough capacity to cover up for the entire demand throughout the year. So you want that peak to ratio to increase over time. So probably it's not 1.4 at the moment, is let's say 1.1, and it's going to be, you would want that to grow over time. Just to give one example. I'm seeing one question.
Yes, there is one question, Marco. Maybe if you want, I can take it to give you 1 second to rest. So the question is, are we taking the percentage arbitrarily or depending on data? So in the case of this simplified model, we took some data arbitrarily for the electricity demand for each sector. So what we have done is that we have calculated the growth rate from 1 year to the previous one in the historical part. And if we look at the industry, it was every year a 4% increase. So when looking ahead to the future, we thought, okay, maybe we can take a growth rate a bit higher. So we put 5%. So this is how Marco has just done it. But in reality, those numbers are not arbitrarily. It would come from the industry modeling sub-module, or in the case of building we discussed on Friday, we will know from the building modeling exercise how much electricity demand came in the past, and we will receive also their forecast on how much electricity demand will come from the building sector. So we will just take this as an input resulting from another modeling exercise.
Absolutely correct. Thanks. Thank you so much, Arno, for explaining this. Remember that all of this, we created it on purpose for this training. So you will be able to use it at your will, but it's based on fictitious data. So because it's based on fictitious data, all of them in the right ballpark, but they are all fictitious. So we, excuse me for the expression, we invented them. Because we invented them, then you see this very stable growth at 4%, 6%, or 5% is simply because it's invented. But it's just to illustrate the idea. As Arnaud said, all of this will come from statistics, and this will come from the modeling of the industry sector. So really, these lines would really come from the other sectors, and that is really the advantage of having an overall model, because you can see the influence of the different parts of the energy sector. Going forward, sorry, because we're approaching the end and I don't want to take too much time, but it was really to show how to develop the exercise. The following question, if I remember, was on changing some elements. Correct me if I am wrong. Yes, so it was to see the impact on gross capacity additions of changing some elements, which are these ones. I will just do one, the change of the first one, the industrial of the change of growth rate in industry. So effectively, we go down. Sorry, we need to enlarge this. No, gross additions, we have it. So we have the total additions, which are 3,832 in this case, megawatts. And we want to see what is the impact of doubling the industrial growth, the growth rate in the industrial sector. So this 3,832, if we put this one to 10%, so a very strong growth, well, this would go to 5,000. The idea of the exercise was to change one by one the elements indicated in that exercise, note them down in a separate spreadsheet, so to see which element has the biggest effect on the overall. We can, well, we will surely share the solutions with you, and you will see, for example, how despite bringing the growth of the transport sector to 30%, the impact will be quite small, because the amount of electricity to start with is very small. Of course, the sectors that are the biggest, so industry and buildings, will have the biggest influence. But also changing the lifetime of power plants can have a very significant impact, but in a longer time frame. In to 2030, the impact is more limited. And I'm sorry, there was a third question. Yes, the impact on CO2 emissions. And with that, I will stop now. We did to keep the this file simplified, we didn't really go very sophisticated on the way you add power plants. So we did simply put it manually in these three points here on gross additions. So one was to say, if I add, for example, 100% of coal subcritical, what is the impact on CO2 emissions? Sorry, let me go back first to the base case. Base case, you go to the total CO2 emissions, which are 205, given those factors that I did put. If I put only, my apologies, I lost it here, only inefficient coal, then those 205 cumulative emissions will grow to 227. If instead I put all hydro plants, so I put 0 new coal and 100% of new hydro, then those emissions will cumulative will decrease to 165, with also one important element, which would mean that this, instead of keeping growing like this, would be brought to almost flattening out. So with the changing completely the trend of growth of CO2 emissions. This in overall the first the how to develop the first exercise that we sent you. We will surely share with the the solutions to the exercise, but we will of course also be very happy to answer any additional questions you might have. With this, I would go back. I don't know if I went back to the presentation with the Q&A slide, and just stop here and see if you have any other questions, and give back the floor to Arno.
Thanks a lot, Marco. So I know it's lunchtime in Addis, but in case you have more time and more questions, we are available. If not, as you know, we can also answer any question that you would send by email or through the WhatsApp group. But let's maybe stay 2-3 minutes to see if some questions come.
If there was anything that was not clear, anything really that comes to your mind, or something that we didn't touch upon that could be of interest or that could be important for you. Because of course, when you're talking about modeling, you're talking about so many different.
Yeah, so there is one proposal to compile the questions and ask by tomorrow. Yeah, that's something we can definitely do. Tomorrow we will discuss the supply part of the modeling approach, but on Wednesday we'll have one session which is more of a quiz and wrap up of what we would have seen in the previous sessions. So you can definitely compile all your questions and ask, and we can address and take time on Wednesday morning to do that. Perfect. Well, so if you don't have more questions now, I'd like to give a big thanks to Marco for his presentation. Thanks a lot, Marco. I think it's been very insightful. Oh, someone raised a hand.
Yes.
Maybe we can give the floor. So I see Temesgen Tesema has asked to speak. So you have the floor. If you unmute, you should be able to speak. Maybe it was a non-unpurpose because the hand is not raised anymore. Okay, so well, thank you very much, Marco. I think it's been super insightful and a very good balance between the slides and the exercise. We will send you the solution so that you can play a bit more and enter into the Excel file, having those two exercises to do. And thank you very much to all of you for your attention. We'll see you tomorrow morning, same time, to discuss the supply side and supply of fossil fuels in the energy model. So thanks, Marco, and have a good day to all.
Sorry, just one answer. Yes, of course, you can have my contact.
Yeah, I will share. Perfect. Have a good
Thanks a
day,
lot.
everyone.
Have a very good day, everyone. It was really a pleasure.